Okay, so now we're recording. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So, Nikki, we were just having a conversation. So, Siobhan talked originally about the week and the fact that you've been interested, I think, Siobhan, in worldviews for some time, but now we're starting to go into a little bit more detail. That you've completed the worldviews assessment, that you struggled with some of the kind of double negatives in the questions. Um, and then you moved on, I think, to polarities and the fact that there's a difference between problems which can be solved and polarities which can only be better managed. And I have to say that since I discovered polarities a few years ago, I've just welcome. I've used polarities a lot in my training programs for managers and also in coaching. I just think they're fantastic once you get your head around them. And I did include an appendix, polarity mapping in the appendix. And that's something that I managed to get into the training program, the kind of foundation training program for one of the large European institutions, which I'm probably not allowed to talk about, but anyway, a large European institution. And so the managers during the 2-day program, we look at polarities and we work on various polarities and we do polarity mapping. So I included some of that in the appendix. One of the things I've also done, if you're interested, we could come back to this another time, but if any of you, are you familiar with positive intelligence? I think I've mentioned it at
Yeah, a
various
little bit.
stages.
Yeah.
So what you can do is you can, well, at least what I think you can do is you can map the saboteurs into kind of what's a Harrison polarity map. So it shows you where the particular saboteurs can show up in terms of the polarities that are out of balance. And then you can work with people to rebalance these particular polarities.
I'm
Yeah.
finding that quite interesting. Sheila, you were going to say something else.
No, same, exactly the same comment I was going to make. So yeah, you carry on, Julia.
I have done the 6-week PQ program, and I found it very helpful for my personal life. So I recommend it to anyone who has the time to do it.
Yes.
I did it at the same time as my new Good Life, the program last year. So I found that challenging at the same time because they're quite time intensive.
Yes.
But I do find them very, very helpful and going deeper into the different types of saboteurs. And I'm finding it very interesting because I also struggle with the concept of would my clients actually go through the program for 6 weeks? And would they stick with it? And I do incorporate some of the things, even I'm doing an impulse talk tonight on resilience, and some of the elements of it I will use as nuggets for people to take away, and they do use them. They do
Mm.
find them helpful. But trying to rebalance by mapping the polarities is another angle that I would be very interested to dive into.
Yes. Okay, well, what I might do then is to set up for next time a short introduction to how I think the saboteurs map into polarities. So, for example, a pleaser. So a pleaser can show up as high helpful, low in terms of assertive. And so one of the things you can do is use the polarity map to help people rebalance that particular polarity. One of my strongest saboteurs is the hyper rational, as you might have noticed, and that can show up as high analytical, low intuitive. And so there are particular polarities that I think are associated with each of the saboteurs. And so one way of weakening their impact is to look at polarity management.
That great. Thanks, Rob. Really useful. I've started to work with the saboteurs with clients. Not straightforward because I am beyond the assessment and we then have this discovery that these are the saboteurs. I then struggle a little bit with how do I coach through that? And I think it's similar with the polarities. I've got to the point where, we can explore, and we also sort of notice and realize that there is a polarity that exists. And I think one of the questions in the LA2 was really good, because it was about which polarities can you think about that show up with your clients. I think I came up with about four. I think I would probably
Yes.
suggest come up regularly. But it's then, okay, now we know this.
Yes. So
What do
what
we
have
do
we?
about
Yeah.
where do we go with it? And I think the next step with them, I think the polarity mapping was a really good, in the appendix. But it's but how do I coach through that? Um, and avoid the teaching through that. I'm conscious that I could end up teaching through that. Um, yeah. So anything that we can move through, and some more help with that would be very welcome. So
Okay.
thank
Well,
you.
actually, what I've got is I remember now. I just had a thought. I've actually done a brochure, or like kind of a brochure that takes people through that I used to give out to managers in the workshop. Um,
Oh,
so I have a little summary of how to manage them, which I can share with you. Um, and so that might be something. Well, I'll send that to you after the
thank you.
conversation, and um, and then we can come back if you have any questions on it. So
Much
I've just
appreciated.
just discovered it. So what I'll send you is this. So managing your saboteurs in the positive intelligence program, there's
Mm.
the particular process for managing saboteurs. And what I was trained in was the Harrison paradox report. And so I can see how the saboteurs map into particular polarities. And so what I've done is for each of the polarities, so if you've got a pleaser, you tend to be low assertive, high helpful. And if you are, so this is the polarity, Harrison polarity, 12
Wow.
important polarities.
Wow.
And what I do is I go through each one looking at polarity mapping for the avoider, how that can show up. Let's just give you some examples. And so what you can do is, in a coaching perspective, is you can take the map and then you can coach people through by getting them to talk about, for example, if we take one that we probably all know and love, which is uh, well, I'll just take one of them. Certain open reflective. Maybe we'll take that. And so we
Yeah.
discovered that certain people have a high, certain low open reflective, and then you ask them, okay, so what would you like to achieve? And if you could balance them, what would be your greater purpose? And then you go down the bottom, say, what do you really want to avoid as an outcome? And then you can start to talk to them about, okay, so if they're high certain, low open reflective, you can say to them, okay, well, tell me a little bit about what are the benefits of being certain in your life? They love being certain, so they give you all the good reasons for why being certain is important. And then you can say to them, okay, and tell me a little bit about open reflective. What are the bad things about being too open reflective? And they'll tell you they know all the reasons why they don't want to be open reflective. So
Yeah.
you get them to talk about their preferences. So high, certain, low, open, reflective. And then you say, well, being open reflective, it does have some benefits too. So what would you think about as being the upsides of being open reflective? And then you say, and being certain, if you're over certain, it does have some negative impacts, doesn't it? And you get them to talk about it. So they come away with a kind of more balanced view of the polarity. And then you can come up with some action steps to support whichever pole is less strong. So, for example, if they're a low open reflective, you could help them brainstorm some things, just try and be a little bit more open reflective, just to see what
Mm,
impact that would have. So that's
mm.
that's one way of coaching people through the polarities, so they become aware of pros and cons of both sides of the polarity, and come away with some short experiments, small safe experiments to test out, just rebalancing them a little over time.
Thank you for picking that one, because I have a client just this afternoon sitting right in this polarity.
Okay.
Um, Perfect.
Right. So
And they're so high certain that they're certain that's the right way.
yes. Yeah. So this is, I mean, I just think I had such a success with this. So I'll send you the little brochure I created, and then you can have a look at it. If you want to come back and ask any questions about it, we could go through it in a bit more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've heard a little bit from Sheila and Siobhan. The rest of you, maybe Julie as well, any other thoughts and any particular insights or questions or concerns from last week too? Well, the second phase, sorry.
I'm happy to wait my turn, but I do have absolute genuinely, but I'm happy to talk about world views again
Okay.
as well. But I'm happy to wait for this bit to fizzle out.
So any particular things you'd like to get out of today? Any questions, comments before we go a little bit more detail into worldviews? No? Okay, so should we go into the sutra space? So let me so it's the self-guided. So I'm not sure how far all of you've got with all this particular phase. I think some of you perhaps got further than others. So if you remember, there was a bit of a look at what is a good life? How do you define a good life? And then what are the contributors to a good life? And we come a little bit back to connection. You can come back to, I mean, the new good life. I'm not sure if you remember, but in the new good life, there's a fourfold connection. It may be that you haven't been introduced to it yet, and it comes later in the program. I'm beginning to lose track of it. But connecting to yourself, connecting to others, connecting to nature, and connecting to something greater turn out to be quite important in terms of living a sense of a good life. So we talk a little bit about that. And then we talk about, okay, connecting to something greater, meaning and purpose. And I also throw in a bit on the flow state because it seems like it's quite important. And if I'm going too fast, just stop me, ask any questions, add any comments, any reflections. And then we come into this polarities. Julia, is that a hand I saw?
Yes. I'm wondering if it fits here, but I'm finding a lot of the concepts that I've been studying in positive psychology that are coming into this space here. And I mean, the Sixth Sense, Mihaly, I never know how to pronounce him correctly, but the the
Yes.
author that deeply talks about this sense, this state of flow and how important it is. And what I'm finding managers, leaders, and teams struggle with if they divide the work in such a way that people don't get into this, and making it harder for everyone versus trying to create a space where these conversations, like Kim Cameron talks about, where you can renegotiate your scope of your role. Those kinds of conversations then do come to mind, and they do fall into the polarity because a lot of the time, polarity, the manager goes, well, you need to perform. And to me, the polarity is not performing and having fun. It's both. Well, I guess then it
Yeah.
is a polarity.
Yeah.
But can we create environments where that is the case for the managers, the leaders, but also the team members? Because then the research shows that in those situations, we do get higher performance. We get higher performing teams and individuals. So I'm finding that
Yes.
quite interesting how it's connecting at this learning adventure too with a lot of the things that I've been reading about.
Yes. Yes. Any reaction to that? I notice in some of the organizations I work for, they tend to recruit people who are perhaps overqualified for the role and are not stretched at all, so they end up in bore in. Um, Whereas yesterday I was talking to one of the coaches who's been through this program and she works in the health service. And she was saying that after COVID, that somehow there were lots of, she works in the health service, and there were lots of vacancies. So people applied for vacancies which perhaps they weren't appropriate for. And so now there's a lot of burnout because the work is too demanding for them. So I've seen in organizations where they've over recruited and people have just been bored, or whether people have not been well matched for the role and therefore they've become burned out. So keeping people, as you say, within the team in this kind of flow area so that they're just sufficiently challenged, I think is really important to individual and team performance. Silla, you're looking sort of reflective there. Are you with us, Silla?
Me or Silla?
Silla.
Silla, okay. Yeah, she's there. She's moved.
Okay.
Yeah, I was reflecting because this whole thing that play and the whole priority is it's really important, I think, in the whole climate conversation and for the new good life, because it's such a serious topic that if you don't bring in some joy and playfulness, you cannot bring into any environment, and that is really really important. So that was what I was reflecting, that we are coming always with my team in Hungary for the same point, that you have to bring some other polarity inside, and that's always joy and play and what you are doing with pleasure. So what's your hobby, what you are doing, and then bring in your hobby and your joy into this really serious topic. So I think here is like polarity is really important.
Yeah. We definitely come back and dive deeper into this in later in this journey. So Bernard's done quite a lot of work in this area, so we'll definitely come back and talk about that in more detail.
Perfect.
Okay, so that was the polarities. So I'm working my way towards Sheila's worldviews, and then we come into worldviews. And I put it in this particular learning adventure because depending on your worldview, you might have quite a different view of what a good life is. And so I think it's worth us as coaches being aware of what our own worldview is and how different worldviews may see the world very differently. And good life for one person may not look at all like a good life for another. And Hannah and I followed the Worldview Journeys program, and we liked the test, so we found it quite useful. And so we came. I mean, I just like the way it's set up. I think it's great. And then so what we do is we study. Well, in this particular worldview model, they focus on four: the traditional, the blue, modern orange, postmodern green, and integral yellow, and look at how people's worldviews change, how people's worlds change as their worldview changes. So the perceptions of each particular, what are the values and what a good life might look like and what the coaching implications could be. Talk about that. And I think there's a summary coming up, isn't there? Yeah, worldview and polarity. So even with the different worldviews, you could see how there may be a tendency to lean into one side of polarity more than another, depending on your worldview. So I thought that was quite interesting. So stability and change. So if you're traditional, maybe you value stability much more over perhaps change, whereas modern orange tends to much more embrace change and progress and performance. So I think it's quite interesting how different worldviews might lean into different poles on the polarity. Sheila, was anything in particular you wanted to bring out?
I think it was more an observation as well, but this is the part of this learning journey that really struck a chord for me. particularly as kind of looking at it as for me as a coach, and how I show up as a coach. And so, for example, I read it all and started to sort of self-analyze which worldview from the list. I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I did the test and it came out different to what I'd said I was. So I sort of sat with that for a bit as well. And I was like, what's that about? And I think it's just encouraging me to have to want to spend quite a bit of time doing some reflection practice with this. It's a bit some of the questions that you've asked us as well in the journey is helped. Well, how is my coaching practice? Um, how can my coaching practice adapt to differing world views? I think I've come close to it, but I've done it within the values lens. So, a client has different values to mine, and we work with that, and that's absolutely fine. And I've learned to, notice my emotions in that space, and work with that. I think this takes it to a slightly um, different way of doing things. Um, so I think the big thing for me is what is my worldview, and sitting with that for a bit, um, and how that should ultimately make me a better coach by
Is it me that's frozen or you?
No, I think it's Sheila.
might
Okay.
show up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, did you lose me for a minute then?
Just a second, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I've just
Okay.
got aside, sorry. I suppose, well, a question, this is quite a practical question. Do you think the world views are generational or not?
Well, is anybody an expert in worldviews before I open my mouth? Does anybody want to come in? Has anybody studied this in enormous detail? No? Okay. Well, I'd say, this is what I think. I think people tend, so it's a bit linked to spiral dynamics. So I think there is quite a strong correlation between spiral dynamics and your worldview. And I've actually got some notes on this in another program, the Making an Impact program, where I do look at the correlation between your where you are in the integral world and how your worldview shows up. So I think there's a tendency for people, well, there can be a tendency for people to evolve. I have to be very careful here, to
Yeah.
change from traditional to modern to postmodern to integrative as they progress through their lives. So I
Yeah.
think there is a
Okay.
little bit of a tendency to move through that. But of course, some people do and some people don't. And what encourages people to change their worldview, I think, is partly their circumstances and finding out that their worldview isn't helping them address particular problems in their life. And so people tend to evolve. So that there is a sort of a growing complexity of perspective as you move from traditional um, to modern to postmodern to integrative. There is a tendency to see the world in a slightly more complex way. And that tends to be something that evolve changes with age.
Yeah. I wondered that. I wondered if, as you become more experienced and start to have, is it confidence? I don't know, or question what's around you, and that you feel, and almost as you feel that maybe life is slipping away a little bit, you might think, I want the good life. I want to hold a world view, or that changes as you get older, um, but then maybe not necessarily, um, because I can think of quite a few people who are older that still are, it sounds awful, that are holding the traditional view. and that's absolutely fine. But would a young person hold a traditional? But perhaps they would if their environment and their family and their structure that they've got around them is around you know certain set ways. So
Yeah, I think, well, it depends. Yeah, there may be more tendency for them to hold a more traditional view if that's what they've grown up in.
yeah,
But I've spoken to young people whose parents were obviously had maybe a postmodern or integrative worldview, and
yeah,
that's rubbed off on them, and they're
exactly.
coming in their teens in a different space, so they're not necessarily going through traditional.
Yeah,
So it depends a
quite.
bit on your context, your upbringing, your education, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah.
Okay, so I noticed, yeah, Nikki.
I believe that we live in a polarity world. Sorry. We live in a polarity world because we live in between yin and yang. And ancient Greeks and Confucius, who lived in ancient China, were saying that we have to live in the middle. So now we say we have to integrate the polarities. Ancient Greeks and wisdom people many years ago said the same.
Mhm.
We came to the same conclusion after so many years.
Yes, it's yeah. So was it the golden mean that somebody talked about? Was it Plato or was it one of the others? But so the golden mean. So not the difference between courageous or cowardly. That somehow you were in the middle. So there's sort of somewhere in the middle, but then but the polarities are different because you're not trying to necessarily have a kind of an average. What you're trying to do is balance lean towards one or the other side of the polarity, depending on what's necessary. So, for example, in the polarity assertive and helpful, for example, sometimes I may need to lean into being more assertive, and sometimes I may need to lean into being helpful. It's not necessarily the best thing to be somehow in the middle between assertive and helpful. So it's finding the right balance for the circumstance.
Yes.
So there's a difference between an average.
To be in the middle, not exactly in the middle, but to understand when you have to be assertive, as you said, or not to be assertive.
Yes, yes. And the problem is that we tend to be rigid in one pole. And so we found that one particular pole seems to work, so we overdo it. And so it's about learning that it's not always appropriate, and sometimes you have to kind of move between the poles, depending on the situations. I rambled on a bit there. Did I make any sense?
Yeah, can I just say two more things and then I won't say more. I just noticed going through the questionnaire that what stuck out for me was that basically the questions were about, as you say, well, nature, spirit, religion, politics. I think they were the four main categories. There might have been another one. I was a bit struck by that. Like, is that what our worldview is made up of? Those four things? And science was the fifth. Those five things. And are we kind of limiting our analysis of our worldview by categorizing it into those five things? That was what I was thinking when I was doing the questionnaire.
A model is always a simplification of reality. So, why did the people choose these particular aspects? So this is where there's in the learning adventure. So they identified these dimensions: ontology, epistemology, anthropology, axiology, and societal wisdom. So they've identified 5 dimensions in which they look at people. And so, you know, talking to the lady who was involved in designing this, I mean, you have to decide on what dimensions are you going to look at, try and see whether something makes sense. And so it seems like quite a good set to me. But is it, I mean, does it fully capture the mysteries of humanity? Absolutely not. I'm sure it doesn't. But so all models are wrong. It's just maybe some of them are useful. And so maybe, you know, I find it quite helpful, but I don't believe that it's, you know, as subtle as it maybe it could be. So it's probably missing out some elements that are important. I don't know. I mean, I've got several reports where it goes into the detail about how they created the worldviews model. If you're interested in going deeper, I can certainly share them with you. So it's about a year since I did the course, so I'm getting slightly rusty on it. But I mean, I think it, as a model goes, I think it's a fairly useful one. Okay. Anything else? So let me just mention what I'll do is I'll open up phase 3 later on, knowing that maybe some of you haven't really finished phase 2 yet, but just to give you a sense of what's coming up in phase 3. So what we've done here is we've linked the phases to the phases in the original My New Good Life learning journey. So what we're looking at here is resources. So we look at sources of energy, creativity, and inspiration. What can you draw on? And then we go much deeper into fourfold connection. Now I can't remember whether you came across the fourfold connection in My New Good Life, and so I'm beginning to lose track of what's in what. But the fourfold connection, I think we kind of alluded to it in the My New Good Life. It's that connection to self, others, nature, and greater. So you remember that model. And there are 4 ways of connecting: body, mind, heart, and soul. So we go through completing the matrix, basically, to look at how you can develop greater connection to yourself, others, nature, and the whole, something greater, through the body, mind, heart, and soul. Does that make sense? So
is that similar to Wilbur, the Wilbur model?
Yeah, I think this is a slightly more sophisticated version of Wilbur.
Okay.
No. So yeah, well, remember we had the four quadrants of Wilbur plus nature plus spirit. So that was my original attempt to simplify what Bernard had done. And here, what we're doing is we're just going slightly deeper so that you've got more background what's being alluded to in that model.
Yeah.
So I say what we're trying to do in My New Good Life Plus is go broader, covering all the elements of the canvas, and slightly deeper so that you understand a little bit more about what's behind some of the stuff. And it may be that in some areas you just need to go deeper, or you don't want to at the moment, and it's fine to skip it. So my intention is not to sort of remove this quickly after you finish the program. My intention is that you can come back to it again and again over a period. And what I'm finding, interestingly, is people who went through the My New Good Life Plus pilot are now going through it again and getting a lot more out of it the second time. So it seems to be something you can come back to again and again. But anyway, so pick what is relevant for you now, do what's you find useful. Don't feel try to avoid feeling overwhelmed by the volume. There's no necessity to do everything. Just do what's useful, then you can always come back to it. So anyway, we go through the fourfold connection, connecting with nature, connecting with the greater, and then we look at interconnected and connecting. So we just look at how the whole thing works together, and look at how the fourfold connection supports resilience and anti-fragility. So why is it useful to build the connections? Well, because it can help you with resilience or anti-fragility. It's probably something we're all going to need. So I think that's about, oh yeah, okay. And then we come back to the New Good Life elements resources, looking at how you can lean on the different elements as resources in your move towards your New Good Life. So that's what's coming up in the next one.